terms of the state of disability representation across brands, the number of protagonists with disability in UK advertising was less than 1%. 20% of the world's population live with a disability. So it's fair to say that the state of authentic disability representation in advertising was pretty woeful. But when I looked behind it, I actually thought, goodness me, I am sort of part of the problem.
Katy Talikowska, a marketing trailblazer
and CEO of the Valuable 500.
We started out off with what was right to do for society, a moral imperative. But the real unlock is the advertising was hugely successful.
So, new boyfriend.
We saw a 7% uplift in sales, and it was and still is the single most effective campaign for 18 years for Maltesers.
You're so bad, is what he said.
So look, what is right for society is fundamentally right for business as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about disability inclusion in business today.
Sadly, there are still too many stigmas. They choose not to talk about it in the workplace. They don't want to be seen as less than. I'm a great believer in the fact that innovation equals inclusion. And that was when the Valuable 500 was born, which was effectively to end the CEO silence on disability inclusion and get them talking about it in the boardroom.
Hey, how are you?
I'm really well, thank you, Peter. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good, thank you. I've been really looking forward to this one. Obviously, we had a conversation at the latter end of last year in respect to your journey and the work that you do, and it was an instigator behind having this conversation here today. So before we dive into it, let's start with a little bit of who you are, what you do and why.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Peter. And yeah, I was going to say, just to reiterate, I absolutely loved our conversation at the end of last year. So I'm really excited to be sitting here now. So I'm Katy Talikowska, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Valuable 500. I think I will officially stop saying after this podcast that I am new in role. I'm relatively new in role, but with my feet firmly under the table. And I think the key thing I would say is that my journey with the Valuable 500, from my perspective, actually began about 5 years or so ago. So it's a massive privilege for me now to be working with a phenomenal team and with the inimitable force of nature that is Caroline Casey to drive the Valuable 500 forward. I've been an ally and a supporter from the outside, pretty much even prior to its inception. So now to be in this role as CEO is a moment of enormous privilege to be able to continue the good work.
When we first started talking, obviously we've both got a love of the work that you guys are doing, and it's incredible the journey that Caroline's been through as well. So maybe before we dive into the work that you're doing today, let's talk about the journey up until Valuable and what you did prior.
My professional career is almost exclusively in advertising and marketing. So I work for a few small independent UK-based advertising agencies, but I did just over 17 years in total working for BBDO offices, mainly in the London office, AMV BBDO, but I also worked in New Zealand and Australia, out of Auckland and Melbourne. So roughly a third of my advertising career was working for BBDO, which is part of Omnicom, and Omnicom happened to be one of our brilliant iconics as well. So background very much in advertising and marketing. And whilst I was at AMV BBDO, the main piece of business that I oversaw was Maltesers. Maltesers was a main brand, but it was Mars Wrigley Confectionery. So as you can imagine, I was terribly popular with my free chocolate cupboard. But I think in terms of the work I did specifically on Maltesers, which I mentioned there, that was really the start actually of both my personal and professional journey and passion towards disability inclusion. So if we can go back to the summer of 2016, that was just in the run-up to the Rio Paralympics. And Channel 4 had just launched their very famous and seminal groundbreaking Superhumans Wanted campaign. So they were the official broadcaster for the Paralympics. And they had done a really necessary piece of research looking at the state of disability representation in advertising across the UK. So they'd done a really comprehensive survey, and they found that the number of protagonists with disability in UK advertising was less than 1%. And actually, when you dug a little bit deeper, the majority of the people in inverted commas living with disabilities were actually non-disabled actors who'd been asked to sit in a wheelchair or maybe carry a cane. So it's fair to say that the state of authentic disability representation in advertising was pretty woeful. Mm-hmm. And I had a bit of a moment of reckoning. Important context to share is that the Maltesers advertising campaign, which I had responsibility for, I was leading it, wasn't doing particularly well. It was fine, but it was a little bit average. It wasn't particularly cutting through. We had a really good platform that we were really proud of, which was about moments of lightness. It was called Look on the Light Side of Life. But the stories that we were telling were a little bit samey. They weren't disruptive, they weren't engaging, they weren't cutting through. But when I looked behind it, I actually thought, goodness me, I am part of the problem. Here I am having done advertising for, at that time, it was best part of 20 plus years. And without sounding trite, I thought I'm a good, decent person. I care about humanity. I think it's really important to be representative and inclusive. And yet there I was working with creative teams and pushing through work that really just wasn't representative of the 1 in 5 of the global population. And that's just wrong on so many levels. So I had a really supportive client in Mitch Oliver, and we said, look, we're going to have a crack. We're going to put our hat in the ring. And we entered 3 scripts into the competition, and we were lucky enough to win. We started off with what was right to do for society, a moral imperative. But the real unlock is not only did we win the competition, but the advertising was hugely successful. We saw a 7% uplift in sales, and it was and still is the single most effective campaign for 18 years for Maltesers. So if there were any naysayers, any people who were saying, oh, it's a nice to have in terms of representation, but is it really going to grow the brand? Is it really going to sell more product? We had that beautiful data point, that nugget. And we were able to say, look, what is right for society is fundamentally right for business as well. But in a corporate world where rightly, very rightly, and come on to this in a moment, worries me that these roles are now being disbanded, but very rightly, companies were appointing chief diversity and inclusion officers. But they were focusing perhaps exclusively on gender 1 year, then it was sexual orientation, then it was race, all of which are incredibly important. But no one was having the confidence, perhaps, to talk about disability. And as I said, that affects 1 in 5 of the global population. And as we know, disability is intersectional. And so Caroline's thinking very rightly was, this is just wrong. So that needs to change. And that was when the Valuable 500 was born, which was effectively to end the CEO silence on disability inclusion and get them talking about it in the boardroom. So Caroline had just set out her stall at One Young World. Because of that, she was given a slot at the main stage at Davos in the January of 2019. And my wheelhouse, my area of expertise, what I did day in, day out, was creating campaigns. And I said to Caroline, can I help? I had a really supportive CEO at the time. We were able to assemble a really passionate team. And on top of our day jobs, possibly wrong that it was on top of our day jobs versus the day job, but on top of our day jobs, we created an awareness campaign to support the launch of the Valuable 500. That was the turning point for me in terms of my real sort of affiliation and passion for the work that Caroline's doing. That was January 2019. So for me to be sitting here 5 years later, now in the CEO role, is pretty beautiful, actually. And with it comes in enormous responsibility. It's pretty scary at times, but I suppose like all important things, nothing important comes easy. So it's a hard job, but it's the best job I've ever had. And to have the focus that we have at the Valuable 500 and to have such a clear mission, to have now 529 corporate partners working alongside us, and the most phenomenal group of disability business experts within our directory, within our community, of whom we have now over 90. And we are truly global. To have that support, to have that expertise, to have that passion, to have that reach, to have that influence to help us drive the agenda of the Valuable 500 is pretty awesome.
Yeah, definitely. And as somebody that's obsessed with activating of a brand's purpose, there's nothing more clear than the work that you guys have done from that journey that you've just articulated up until where you are today. It resonates with the premise of good brands create moments, but great brands create movements. And this whole movement, the global movement that you've managed to achieve with Invaluable is just a credit to everybody involved. And it's inspiring. There's bits and pieces that you talked about in there that I want to circle back to, but I'll probably bring it up a bit later in respect to storytelling and branding. But at this point in time, in respect to your new role, maybe let's talk a little bit more about the strategic priorities that you have, and I guess a bit of an exploration into the role of disability inclusion in business today.
When Caroline and the team got the all-important 500th CEO signature, that was the 18th of May 2021. Since then, what the team have been doing in partnership with both the disability business community and the companies was to research and innovate to drive focus. Because if we are going to deliver meaningful systems change, we have to start with an element of focus. Otherwise, you'd just be trying to boil the ocean. So it was through that innovation and research that we've got effectively 3 pillars. And we talk, and I can explain this in a moment, we talk about the power of synchronized collective action to deliver against those 3 areas of focus. So the 3 biggest system barriers which have formed our areas of focus are lack of inclusive representation within leadership, lack of inclusive reporting, and that's the workforce representation within companies, and lack of inclusive representation in media and marketing, which I can come on to in a moment. And we have a really clear focus and strategy, and we also have a deadline and a milestone to hit, because in the spirit of nothing focuses the mind like a deadline, and we are very much about driving action. We have very intentionally, as an organization, flipped from activism and awareness driving into accountability, delivery, and accountable actions, because I know this is an overused phrase, but the time to act really is now. And we're getting that sense of momentum from our companies, who all individually, to give them their dues, and they're a humble bunch, genuinely, despite the fact that these enormous, awesome, fearsome organizations, from Apple to Mahindra to Google to Microsoft to Sky to the BBC, just to name a few, they are all doing good things within their own right against those 3 pillars. But going back to what I was saying, Peter, around synchronized collective action, we believe in the power of the collective. We believe in creating this movement and sense of community. And we feel that if we are collectively, across the might of 529 global organizations, addressing the same problem at the same time, in the same way, that's when we're truly going to see meaningful change. So the deadline that I was talking about is IDPD, so 3rd of December, 2025. So we will be holding SYNC25, which is the Valuable 500 Accountability Summit. The current thinking, it's a big thing to organise. We have brilliant partnership and sponsorship from the Nippon Foundation, who are our largest philanthropic benefactor. So in Tokyo, IDPD, 3rd of December 2025, we will be hosting this 2-day accountability summit, SYNC25. And the thinking behind that is, between now and SYNC25, we will be working collectively with our companies through this spirit of synchronized collective action on those 3 areas of leadership, reporting, and representation. And we will be supporting them so that when we arrive in Tokyo collectively, we can report back, we can track the truth, we can share that collective synchronized data to show the progress that we are collectively making. And that is really important, because if you don't measure something, you can't manage it. And if you don't measure it, then you can't improve it. So to have that moment of reckoning, if you will, where we come together with our companies to see and evidence that the data and the collective progress that we're making is really critical. And then what we will do, not suggesting that the job will be done on those areas, but then we will work with a focus group to look at the next 3 areas that we will begin to address. And our ambition is that SYNC25 will then become SYNC27, that will then become SYNC29. And our ambition is to do it every 2 years. Because much as I would love to say that the job will be done by 2025, the reality is it won't. But we are confident that we will make significant progress by then, and then we'll be able to set out our stall for the next 2 years.
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked about this before in respect to the power of movement thinking. And the very essence of what you're trying to achieve is the galvanization of a collective good of people towards a common cause. And we look around the world today, and there is so many different elements that we can address. And I think this only happens by basically activating that central brand purpose between brands and shifting from the lens from the old school of competition towards collaboration. And when we're able to galvanize people, both internally to the organization and wider externally to the partners and communities in which we partner with and serve, then we can start chipping away at some of these larger, more pressing problems that we see within society today. So when I see the work that you're doing now, for me, it's very much an evidence-based, a case study of the power of purpose, because you're able to see tangible results and actions that are taking place. You talked at the beginning about decisions made in boardrooms, and a lot of driven by specific targets on revenues and focus on that particular element. But largely, when you are able to connect to something bigger than yourself, which is bigger than profit, profit becomes a byproduct of what you can achieve. And that's why I've always talked about purpose being a lifeblood of a company. It flows throughout every part of a business, be that the organizational culture to its wider strategy. And that's what empowers me about the world that we're heading into. It's one where people are being a bit more ambitious in their goal setting rather than just saying that we want to make X amount of revenue by said quarter. It's actually, no, we want to address these larger problems and drive some positive partnerships for change. So yeah, like SYNC is a great example of this because it will go down as a positive case, not simply about the work that you've achieved, but the collective action that you've been able to drive.
100%. And it is really important to note that if you think about the companies that we work with, lots of them compete ordinarily tooth and nail. If I take as an example, just the tech sector, so working with Sony, Microsoft, Apple and Google, they all day to day, in terms of the products and the services and the tech that they develop, they are effectively competing against each other. But what I love is that they are genuinely unified in their common goal to end disability exclusion in business. It also happens that they probably might have a greater competitive edge in terms of the products that they're selling. And thinking about tech, I'm a great believer in the fact that innovation equals inclusion. So they understand that if they are creating the next phone that just delivers the most effortless, enjoyable, simple user experience, by virtue of doing that, if that is your driving goal, it's going to be accessible for everyone. But as I said, there is that byproduct. But actually what joins our companies is that greater goal. You mentioned the importance of culture, Peter. And again, our companies can have brilliant strategies and brilliant policies. But if the culture isn't right, then everything else falls by the wayside. And having the right culture, and again, like you, I am naturally an optimist. And I think it is really important because people want something bigger than just coming in and just ticking numbers off a spreadsheet. They want to be driven by something bigger than that. And if you have the right culture that engenders that and that sense of slightly higher purpose, it's just this beautiful sort of serendipitous moment where people will stay longer, they will be more engaged, they will be more productive, they will be happier. So it really should be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But for the companies and the businesses that don't understand the importance of culture and really leaning into purpose at that higher level, I don't think they're going to succeed.
You mentioned there's no innovation without inclusion, and I would definitely agree with that. And equally, I think that by this kind of collective collaboration that you drive in, I think also it powers diversity of thought as well. So when you look at companies, a lot of global corps are generally siloed in their mentality. It's like what's happening internal, and they don't often look externally, and they don't often partner with externals towards progression, innovation, thought leadership. And I think that by putting those foundations in place, you're able to allow for more discussion around a wider narrative that isn't just simply how a company is performing in the short term. It's cultivating that future conscious thinking and behavior to drive some more long-term achievements.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued as well about this authentic representation white paper that you guys have been doing. So I'd love to dive into that if I could.
Of course. We published this not that long ago. It feels a while ago now, but it was on the Wednesday during Davos with the World Economic Forum. It was launched by Caroline. It's a piece of work that we're really proud of. Boy, was it necessary. So it's a white paper talking about the importance of authentic representation across all media and branding and communications. And that's both the internal corporate facing communications or websites, collateral, etc., but also the external marketing material. But also thinking about the whole go-to-market process as well. You've got to think about it within the products themselves. It's all very well having accessible, inclusive campaigns, but if the products can't be used by the people that you're representing. So it is about that whole thing. And what we did was we were lucky enough to partner with both Yale and Open Inclusion. And we carried out both quantitative and qualitative research. We did a survey across 15 different countries with over 1,000 disabled people. So it was a combination of things that we did. First was to establish a base point and a reporting in terms of the state of disability representation. And then the qualitative bit through the survey and the focus group was talking to people with disabilities about how they wanted to be authentically represented in communications, which I suppose goes back to what I was saying a long time ago in 2016 when I was doing the Maltesers thing on a smaller scale. It was you very much have to talk to the people that you want to represent if you are genuinely going to do so with integrity and authenticity. So we are really proud of our white paper, which we've called Nothing About Us Without Us, a very important phrase for the disabled community. And it's really about the path to sustained progress and accountability in inclusive disability representation. So a really important piece of work. We have some definitive case studies in there from Zalando, L'Oreal, P&G, and Sony. And I think from our perspective, this is the start of a journey on representation. What we will be doing next is working with a panel of thought leaders, disability advocates, and activists at a global level to go, okay, we've put together this thought leadership piece, making the case and showing the impact through the case studies of the benefits, both societal and from a business perspective, of authentic and inclusive representation. But what next? As we work towards SYNC25 in Tokyo, what is the specific call to action, the specific synchronized call to action that we are going to ask of our companies? Because I suppose that's the two sort of levers within the Valuable 500. We go out and make the case, we research, we innovate, we show case studies, we bring in our companies, we bring in the disability business community. But then in the spirit of accountability and delivery, what are we actually asking our companies to do? So that's something that we're working on at the moment. And then we will communicate that. And then as we do, we'll put tools, processes and assets in place, because importantly, Peter, it's not just us saying to our companies, see you in Tokyo. We obviously will help and shape those conversations and that progress, tracking the truth, measuring the data so that we can show up, report back at SYNC25.
Yeah, definitely. It's also intriguing, the evolution of brands. Like I'm obviously going to touch upon this with our love of branding and marketing, but the evolution of brand, like beforehand, back in the day, we just had to sell. And it was that old Glengarry Glen Ross, always be selling mentality. But today, like brands are literally catalysts for change. And if you're able to galvanize people and you're able to look towards more holistic aims and goals, then a brand becomes bigger than what it's traditionally achieved. So I look at things today, and for me, brands that really stand the test of time are ones that stand up and represent something. So obviously everybody points towards Patagonia as being a great brand, but it's one of many. And I think that this is the premise of the evolution of brand. It's not simply about sales. It's more so about how do we get involved in these larger global society issues, and what is our voice, because it is ultimately the utilization of voice. So yeah, I'd love to get your take on the evolution of brand over the last 10, 20 years.
Brands understand that they have a responsibility, because boy, do they have a massive opportunity to do more than simply sell a product. And I understand on a commercial sense, that's probably in terms of their bottom line, what used to be the only thing that really mattered. But I think happily, consumers are increasingly more discerning. And it's a really important thing, especially for slightly younger consumers. It isn't just about, does this product taste slightly better? Is this service slightly better? Whatever it may be. They will actively reject brands that don't use their influence, their power, their might, their reach, their spend to do more than just sell products. So for me, they are inextricably linked. I think consumers will increasingly reject brands that don't do it and don't lean into purpose in a truly authentic and engaged way. So there is a massive risk for brands that don't step up and understand the opportunity they have, but also the responsibility they have to have that voice and to have that level of influence. Because if you, again, forgive me, I'll go back to an example of Mars, chocolate. Everybody pretty much likes chocolate. And the spend that would go behind an advertising campaign, you're reaching anywhere between 80 to 90% of, let's say, the UK population. Globally, it would normally be around 70 or 80. But if you have got that opportunity, if you're in that moment of privilege where you are connecting with an individual and a consumer, then why wouldn't you get really excited about the opportunity to look at changing behavior and deliver an important message above and beyond saying my product tastes better than product XYZ on the market? So I think marketers really understand the need for that. I think they know that their brands will die if they don't step up and they don't use their voice in the right way. Because as I said, happily, and again, this is my point of optimism, consumers will absolutely reject those brands that don't.
We see it in respect, obviously, chocolate industry. It's always faced its challenges. I used to work at Nestle, so I know those challenges fairly well. So if you look at brands that I'm really intrigued from that perspective, I think we've talked about Tony's Chocolonely before, but what they do in respect to the Tony's premium, the amount of money that they pay the farmers at the very beginning of the cycle, and also the wider aspect about what they want to do in respect to the eradication of child labor within that particular industry, that want to drive impact, drives also resonance to the consumer, because we're in an age of conscious consumerism whereby people are a little bit more attuned to what's going on in the world. And when we see things that don't really align to our value space, then this is where, as you say, people do step away from brands, and then other brands start to elevate because there's a lot more resonance there. I think before connection comes empathy. And when you're able to empathize with people's struggles, people's challenges, and equally drive action and impact around that, then this is the power of a great brand. I also think there's an evolution in storytelling as well. So I'd also, before I dive back into the work you're doing at Valuable, I really want to pick your brain about storytelling and how you think it's evolving.
From a comms perspective, all good comms has to lean into the power of storytelling. That's what engages an audience. But I think in a world where there are so many brands, there's so much proliferation of brands and communication, the stories that you tell have to be disruptive. They have to be different. They have to be meaningful, without stating the obvious. From a Mars perspective, we always used to talk about be meaningful, be disruptive, and be understood. So I'm a massive advocate and believer in the power and the influence of storytelling. But I think you need to tell the stories from different perspectives. Let's say if you've got a kitchen scene, perhaps however many moons ago, and probably not that long ago, you would always have a family scene that was pretty much identikit. It was largely a heterosexual couple with 2 kids, and 99% of the time they were white. And that just isn't representative. So there's a casting point, but there's also the stories that you are telling in order to be authentically representative. And obviously my area of focus is around disability representation, but it can't end there. It has to be across the board, because that's how you're going to engage and bring people in. So I think it's that combination of reflecting the consumers that you want to appeal to, but always challenging yourself as a marketeer to be disruptive and to be innovative and to be different. Because if you do have the opportunity to connect on that emotional level versus a more sort of standard trotting out the same kind of narratives, then that's when you're going to see huge success. And I think what's lovely, if I can use an example of really beautiful storytelling that was so inextricably linked with the actual product. If you think of Apple's recent beautiful ad, The Lost Voice, directed by Taika Waititi, that honestly gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. It is a beautiful story, which I now know, and actually there is a story being read in that, and I now know that Apple have brought it out as an audiobook as well. And for those who aren't aware, the products that feature is a voice capturing technology. So you can use your own voice to be played through your Apple devices. And it was a story of a grandfather who had lost the ability to speak, but through Apple technology, he was still able to read a bedtime story to his granddaughter with his own voice. And that's so powerful. And that for me is just a story that I think has universal human appeal. And it's an authentic story, and it's inextricably linked to the product. And I think that's when the magic happens. When you're trying to tell a story and you're tacking the brand on and you're tacking the product on and it isn't baked within it, that's when I think consumers switch off or tend to be a little bit cynical. But yeah, just in terms of a recent story from a brand that I have seen and witnessed over the last few months, I would definitely call that Apple Lost Voice. It's really beautiful.
Like, it's one of those that draws at every sense, and the ability to draw out real emotion and heartfelt connection to a particular narrative. That's the beauty of brand in my eyes, when they go beyond simply just articulating a narrative and start harkering to the emotional connection. Like even back in the day, I remember when Nike's Just Do It ad came out, and you had that Walter dude that was in his 70s trekking over the bridge in San Francisco and trudging 17 miles a day, and you just had that warmth inside your stomach when you were able to look at a narrative like that. And that was a driving factor to some of their long-standing change, just small moments. I think when brands are able to articulate those narratives that draw out emotional connection, and draw out empathy and draw out kindness and clarity and connection in respect to the messages that you want to share. That allows for real progression in respect to community and consumer engagement. But I want to hark back a little bit to the pillars that you mentioned before in respect to leadership, reporting and representation, because there is a lot of evolution as well. So I'm interested to get your take on the evolution of leadership and also what you want to achieve with Invaluable from a leadership perspective and how you plan to shape and mold the business going forward.
If I may, let me just touch briefly on our leadership pillar. I was talking before about the representation white paper. We've just commissioned an author to write a paper on inclusive leadership, and that will be continuing. I suppose really the original call to arms from Caroline to end the CEO silence. So what we're doing is we'll have a leadership white paper, and informing that will be research and interviews with C-suite leaders within our valuable 500 companies to talk about their own perspective on inclusive leadership, the cultures within their organization. That will be really critical. So we're working through that at the moment. And also within leadership, which is a program that we're fiercely proud of, and we piloted it last year with Verizon, a program called Generation Valuable. And this is a unique reverse mentoring program where we match C-suite leaders with next generation talent of tomorrow with disabilities. So creating a space of psychological safety. It's a 6-month program where they're matched together. We have a program of events. We ask them to create a blueprint for action. We piloted it last year with 77 companies. We'll be rolling it out again, a revamped, optimized program. We've taken on board the fabulous and really rich and engaging learnings that we've got to optimize it. That will be coming out in May of this year. So that's Generation Valuable, and that is critical. And it won't surprise you that the feedback that we got from the pilot was as positive from the C-suite mentors as it was from the mentees. They were learning, they were truly understanding a different person's perspective and what it was like to be someone within their company living with a disability. So that's been really important because leaders have a responsibility to drive that culture. And the reality is I'm a great believer in building from the ground up through ERGs and sort of your more grassroots activism. But you've also got to have, I've heard people say, if you focus on the bottom and you focus on the top, the middle will take care of itself. Let's see. But I think importantly, the power of having a C-suite leader coming out and either choosing to talk about their own disability, either direct lived experience or through family members, talking about those kind of things, the cultural unlock for that is absolutely critical. So I think from our perspective, the combination of the leadership white paper and the Generation Valuable program is going to go a really long way to that, because we spoke about the importance of culture. Yes, you can have your strategies and your policies, but in the spirit of if you don't see it, you can't be it. You've got to have that right environment where everybody can bring their whole self to work, not worry about masking or feeling stigmatized or seeing less than. And if you have that change and you have that influence from the leaders, then I think that's really important. So if I then pivot to leadership within the Valuable 500, we've just revamped our leadership team. We have Stéphane Lebois, who is our Chief Communications and Programs Officer. He is responsible for looking after our community of the disability business community, working with them, helping understand their expertise and effectively matchmaking with the needs of our companies. And that's why he's got that dual part in his title of programs, developing those programs that will help our companies deliver against those 3 synchronized collective actions. And then we have Gitka Kaur, who's our Chief Operating Officer, and we also have Ryan Curtis-Johnson, who's our Chief Communications Officer. So we have a new galvanized leadership team. We are a small organization, but at the moment there are 15 of us in terms of full-time employment. And when you think that we work with 529 global companies, I think the total number of employees that we would work with from our companies are around 23 million. So we have to punch above our weight. So as I said at the beginning, it's a really big job, but I'm very confident that we have the right talent in place. And ultimately what really helps and drives us forward is the fact that we have focus. So it is a hard job, but we are very singular in our focus and in our strategy. And the key thing for me as a leader is really to drive action, because that is the pivotal change. And that's why we're authoring our white papers. We're looking at our self-ID resource guide. We're working on something called a digital hub, which will be a single source of truth and information for our companies to have access to, where we'll have our calendar of events for engagement. We'll have our library of all our resources. We will have a sort of a notice board thing where we can connect our peers as well, going back to your point, Peter, about the power of the collective and the power of community, and the fact that it's almost that rising tide philosophy of us all coming together. We will be setting up a thing where someone in China who works in a certain role could have a particular challenge over X, and we will effectively matchmake them to somebody who could be working in Paraguay, but they too have a similar challenge, or maybe they've had great success and they want to just shout from the rooftops. But again, it's what can we do as a small team to put that infrastructure in place to engage our companies and engage the disability business community, to cross-pollinate, to share, to learn from successes, to learn from failures, and move together. So I think that's the single critical thing for me as a leader. It's to put those strategies in place to allow that communication, to allow that matchmaking, if you will. It's almost like we play Cupid in the middle, but also to really turbocharge that movement and that sense of community to bring together the might of the companies and also the might of the disability business community.
Yeah, definitely. We've talked a lot about what you plan to do and systems and strategies that you have in place. Before I talk about thoughts of the future, you did mention self-ID resource guide. So I'd love to touch upon that just a little bit more in detail.
The self-ID resource guide we published at the beginning of January, and we developed it in partnership with two phenomenal organizations, Google and Deloitte. This was a follow-up from a reporting white paper that we launched in 2023. The Self-ID Resource Guide was authored by our previous Chief Innovation Officer, a phenomenal woman called Rhiannon Parker. So massive thanks to Rhiannon for doing that, because I think we're all collectively really proud of the Self-ID Resource Guide. But I think what's critical for me to say is we're not claiming within it to have all the answers. I think it's really important for people to understand that self-ID is a process. And again, it goes back to the culture and the environment. What we will do next is, once we've got our companies to start to adopt and include in their policies this resource guide, we will then look to have case studies out of which we hope to be more directional, more pointed, and have those case studies to perhaps develop a bit of a playbook. So see the self-ID resource guide as step 2 of 3 necessary parts of our inclusive reporting journey. Because in the white paper, we worked with Allianz and the London Stock Exchange Group to come up with 5 harmonised KPIs. That was around workforce representation, which is obviously the main topic of the Self-ID Resource Guide, looking at goals, looking at training, looking at employee resource groups, and looking at digital accessibility. So the thinking there is getting all our companies to adopt those 5 standardised KPIs into their annual reports, and that is a big step towards SYNC25. So coming out of that was the Self-ID Resource Guide. The truth is, it is a really complex subject, but it is absolutely critical, because the reality is that it is the individual's right and the individual's prerogative as to whether or not they want to identify, whether or not they want to disclose how they best live their life, how they identify in their workplace. Because as we know, sadly, there are still too many stigmas, and some people choose to mask. If their disability is invisible, they choose not to talk about it in the workplace because they don't want to be seen as other. They don't want to be seen as less than. They don't want to be seen as different or special, in inverted commas. However, in order for a workplace to be rich and diverse and happy and successful and productive, I believe passionately in the fact that you do need to bring people in who see the world differently. It would be a very dull place if we all tackled problems, challenges, marketing briefs in exactly the same way, going back to storytelling, going back to how you emotionally engage. You need that diversity of thought. So working with our companies to make sure that they have the right policies and strategies in place, but also, as I said before, have that right cultural environment where people feel comfortable bringing their whole self to work, saying, this is me, this is how I work best. That's really important. But I'm very sensitive to the fact it is very complex and it is nuanced, but it is critical. that companies do ensure that their recruitment policies, and importantly, when people come into the organization, they feel comfortable and they feel safe to talk about who they are, the environment that they work best in, any reasonable accommodations that they need. That's really critical, because we do see with companies, recruitment is one thing, but you can get people into an organization, but big problems with attrition and retention and turnover. And you don't see that to such high percentages and rates with people who don't self-identify as living with a disability. And it's really hard. So complex, but really critical.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a challenging market as well. If you look at the moment in a sector that I'm fairly well abreast to, and that's the games industry, there's been so many layoffs of amazing people. And I think when it comes to hiring people, it's not about hiring people on per se of what's listed on their experience, but it's hiring people based upon character, their beliefs, their values, and structure it in a way that when you're trying to embed people into a new organization, that they have the ability to share their collective voice about the wider issues that are at hand. When it comes to innovation, you need to have that ability to have that insight from a wider field. And it's encouraging in respect to how business is evolving. When I started Purpose Made, it wasn't necessarily on the fact that it was going to be one of this instantaneous things where businesses were going to naturally gravitate and evolve. It's an educational phase where people are informed and inspired in respect to what's taking place now and the reasons why, but equally those kind of small steps towards the journey of change. You need to basically show people the seeds of change that's upon them, but equally walk hand in hand together through this particular pathway to allow for businesses and their wider employee base and communities to understand what it is you're about, why you're evolving, and how you can really activate your people internally and externally to organizations that you serve. And it's a journey. That's why when we talk about purpose, it's not just a term, it's not a document. It is very much the essence of a business and what you stand for and represent. And when you're able to dream more about what you can really achieve as an institution, then you start to see things like what you guys have done with such a small headcount, with such a large reach and influence take place, because these kind of larger movements can only really occur when you have more ambition about what you want to achieve and ultimately drive that action and impact in the day-to-day consistencies to allow for some of these larger objectives to be drawn out and solutions to come from some of the world's challenges that we face. But that's my viewpoint in respect to where things are evolving. I think leadership is a very different view of what leaders used to be of the past. Leaders now have to be a little bit more emotionally connected to the world around them and have more of a say about what they want to achieve. But before I ask for key thoughts and takeaways and thoughts for the future, I just wanted to ask you what your viewpoint is upon the premise of purpose and how ultimately purpose plays out within Valuable 500.
Purpose has to come from within and be authentic and true to the individual. I think my challenge sometimes is organisations can almost look at a shopping list of different, forgive my slightly reductionist language, but different fashionable topics, for example. I think it has to be baked in within your values, your individual culture, if that makes sense. So from my perspective, when I think about my purpose, I will always frame it in what drives me. How do I frame everything that I do? What's my moral compass, my code of conduct? Because if it is just an arbitrary purpose that has been slapped on, and I would say that from a brand perspective, which is the importance of the power of authentic storytelling, but I think from an individual's perspective and a leadership perspective, you have to really believe it. It has to come from within, because otherwise you won't genuinely be able to do it. And it should infuse and inform everything you do. It should be your North Star. So I think from a personal perspective, from a branding perspective, it's really getting to the nub of that. And then you should have that beautiful, clear focus and pathway, because purpose without authenticity, purpose without meaning, purpose without that real truth from within isn't purpose. It's just tokenistic. And most importantly, it will play into the hands of the skeptics and the cynics who classify people, who identifies people being brands of purpose or people with purpose as just do-gooders, or they're just doing it because it's the fashionable, trendy thing to do. So don't play into those hands, but work hard on defining and understanding what is your own personal, individual purpose as a leader. And I think what's good is leaders talk a lot more about the legacy that they want to leave behind. And I think almost if you work backwards, it's how would I want to be remembered? How would the people that I care about most in the world talk about me in the most positive sense? Perhaps in the old days in the corporate boardrooms, it was all about the end of a CEO's tenure. It was just about sales results. Did I achieve it? Did I hit it? Did I grow by X% as opposed to whatever else it may be? But actually, there is this sense of starting a company or a brand on a trajectory. Doesn't need to be completed, but what was the meaningful change that I implemented with it and embedded within the culture, embedded within the DNA of the organization that I was responsible for, that I can step away from, but that will still be there for others to continue and to evolve and grow. I hope that makes sense. I know I've conflated both sort of individual purpose with corporate purpose. But I think if that purpose and that culture has to come from the top and the leaders, that's what I would encourage leaders to do. Don't sign up to stuff unless you truly believe in it and you feel it is the right fit for how you operate as an organization and that you can truly deliver against it. So, yeah, I think it has to start from within and you need to live it and feel it and breathe it. Otherwise, you aren't going to succeed.
I think the last time we talked, we ended up talking about legacy and impact and how that ultimately is a key driver for us rather than simply monetary goals and aspirations. And I think that is also an evolution of leadership, the fact that they are looking not necessarily at achieving their own internal goals, but also enabling the dreams of others, I would say. So that's the power of true leaders, when they think a little bit more about their impact within what they can do for other people rather than simply for themselves.
You have to have that. You have to have that wider purview. You have to have that more genuinely more altruistic perspective. And I think that is the beauty of true leadership, knowing that you have set the scene, started the pathway, the journey for others to thrive, others to succeed, others to live their own dreams and move forward. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I could talk to you all day. I've always enjoyed chatting to you. I guess before we close out, I just want to finish off with key thoughts and takeaways, like what you want to achieve in the coming years ahead and like a lasting message that you'd like to leave with our audience.
Okay, so for me, as I said, it will go beyond SYNC25, but the big thing for me is getting as many of our companies to meaningfully show up either in person or obviously it will be a hybrid event as well, and stand with us together in the spirit of what I would define as the positive side of accountability. And I want to dwell on that a little bit because it's interesting when I talk to people about holding each other to account and taking account and being accountable. Some people get quite anxious about that and go, oh, goodness me, it sounds like league tables and rankings. And what if I'm not doing as well as someone else? And is it going to be finger pointing and named and shamed? That is absolutely not the case with us. I'm a great believer in the power and actually the liberation of taking account because it's about taking ownership. And I think that is really critical. We have to understand that in order for us to progress, we need to take ownership of where we are now and then work together, going back to the power of the collective. At SYNC25, yes, we will be spotlighting particular success stories, but we will not be naming and shaming. It is about how we have collectively progressed together and the impact that we have collectively delivered. So it is truly and will be that community spirit, that sense of momentum and true movement. So for me and the Valuable 500, we are very squarely focused against those three synchronized collective actions and SYNC25 and enabling and helping our companies to get there. The thing I would say perhaps as a takeaway is when I first came into this role, I think like lots of people, if you really are passionate about what you want to do and you care so deeply about it, I had moments of imposter syndrome, very conscious of the fact that I do not self-identify as living with a disability. I have family members who are disabled, so I have an element of experience and I can see the world through their eyes. but I have a corporate branding and marketing background. And I say that with absolutely no shame at all, because I understand the power of the brands and the storytelling and everything that we can do to drive meaningful change. But I did worry, and I was fearful. I was fearful of getting it wrong, saying the wrong thing, not being seen as having the right to have a voice, perhaps. And I would encourage people to, from my perspective, the only mistake that anyone can make is not to start and not to try and not to have the conversation. I will possibly be having a conversation. I could use a piece of language that someone would prefer I didn't. There's lots of debate around the right language within the disability space. But the worst thing that anyone can do is not to start and not to try. And that really drives me forward, because I have had moments where I've just thought, yeah, am I a bit of an imposter? And I've been challenged by a few people. We can go on for hours about the importance of active allyship. And if 20% of the world's population live with a disability, if we're going to drive change, you need the remaining 80% to work together and be proper drivers of change and allies. But I think too many corporates, too many businesses are worried about getting it wrong, worried about not being good enough. I feel we were talking before about the importance of data. You talk about dirty data, but there's no such thing as bad data. We honestly don't care if, in terms of our companies, in terms of their inclusive reporting within their workforce representation, it'd be better if it wasn't, but let's say it's 1%. That's okay. Just report that, because then we can grow. Then we can work together to drive that change. But I think too many companies are hamstrung by fear. Is someone doing better than me? Do I really know what I'm doing? But the truth is no one is getting it 100% right yet. But if we don't try, then we have no chance of succeeding. And again, through the power of the collective and the community, we learn from each other, and we will learn as much from failures, and there will be bumps in the road. But I would say, don't shy away from the importance of being accountable for your actions, accountable for the way you run your business. Take ownership and measure. But also just on a personal level for allies, don't be hamstrung by fear and fear of getting it wrong, because the only thing that would be wrong would be not to start.
Yeah, definitely. It's a beautiful way to put it. At the end of the day, so many leaders, they are fearful, and you see it in the narratives that we see. We are the world's beating this and we're doing that. But without failure, you don't really learn. There's no evolution. There's no journey. There's no lessons to take away. And it's the ability to share mistakes as well as successes in order to create that wider narrative of trust. Because if you don't have trust, then everything falls by the wayside. So yeah, it's really encouraging and awesome to hear you talk about your own vulnerabilities, because that's something that resonates with a lot of leaders, the imposter syndrome, and the ability to work through that and share that narrative is really powerful. So yeah, thank you.
Pleasure. But one quick thing, if I may, Peter, just to end on that, is a phenomenal man, Christopher Patner at Google. He runs their accessibility labs. And I heard him talk at M-Enabling conference in Washington in October. And he was talking about accessible products at Google and how they innovate. And he said very often they get it wrong. And he said he gets on social media, people saying, oh, we tried this product and it wasn't right for me. And my disability is different to someone else's disability and it didn't work. And they have lawsuits taken against them and pretty tough. And he said, look, we will get it wrong. When you innovate, you don't always get it right first time. So his call to arms was to say, shout and scream and tell us we've got it wrong, but then help us. Don't shout and scream and sue us. And that's quite a binary example. But I love what he was saying about that, because it is that element of vulnerability. It's that element of self-awareness, but going, we are trying. We are on this path. We're on this journey collectively together, but we need each other. Otherwise, we aren't going to succeed. So if you've got a problem, say so, talk about it, but then choose to help, because that's what we need. And again, it's about bringing those different, diverse and inclusive voices in order to improve and grow and evolve.
Yeah, definitely. Like, progress isn't linear. It's tiny gains and consistency. And when you see people prepared to go on that journey, then over the course of time, real impactful change can occur. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. I knew this would be awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. No, I really loved it. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.